I'm alive. I shouldn't be.
He should not be alive. This is unfucking believable.
From the heart of trucker America, my boy Reed Coverdale, host of The Naturalist Capitalist.
This is what government does. It sucks.
If you think you're going to win people over by stating commonplaces, you're just selling the other part.
It is about dictating every transaction that you have for the rest of your life.
Mr. Potato Head.
Coverdale is the guy to be president of the United States.
You intimidated me with your perfect 74 stat.
That was the beginning of my problem.
He died doing what he loved, chasing a minor.
But I'll put a 50 cal attached to my Suburban.
Libertarians need to get out of New York.
The gulag is going to be in your house.
This guy's a fucking murderer. He deserves to be in a dungeon.
Gotta get him out of that truck at night and get him into the White House.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Naturalist Capitalist. Before we get into anything, I want to point out this snazzy new t-shirt that I have. This you can get at toplobster.com. I'm not sure if Caterpillar is going to press charges for kind of ripping off their design there. Hopefully not, but you can go check that out, toplobster.com, and you'll find the Naturalist Capitalist section. There's a whole bunch of hoodies, hats, stickers, anything you want. There's also stuff for Tower Gang, Liberty Lockdown, No Way Jose, Break the Cycle, and then a whole bunch of other stuff that you can get. So go check out toplobster.com. On top of that, I had Ron Paul on my show last week. If you missed that interview, go check it out. It's the episode right before this one. And it's also one of the featured videos at the top of my channel. So make sure you go check that out, share it around. That was a major milestone for this channel and for me, for sure. So go check that out. Also, as always, trying to push you guys to my other platforms. If you're watching this on YouTube live, it'll be on Odyssey pretty soon. And then it'll be on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, a few other audio platforms. Make sure you follow me on all those. You can find links to those places in the description. I think Odyssey is down right now. They're having some issues, but once it's back up, you'll find me there. Anyways, I got a good guest tonight. I've been really impressed with all the guys from antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute, so I'm trying to actually get them on the show. I had Dave DeCamp on a couple weeks ago. Hoping to have Keith Knight on soon, but tonight we've got a fellow manual transmission enthusiast, fellow fan of Adam Fitzgerald and collecting World War II military surplus, have a lot of stuff in common. And he's also super anti-war and interesting to talk to. Patrick MacFarlane from the Libertarian Institute. How you doing tonight, man?
Doing good, buddy. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So, yeah, why don't you just give us a little intro since you haven't been on the show before? What got you connected with the Libertarian Institute? What got you into libertarianism and specifically the whole foreign policy side of things?
Yeah, well, so I am a practicing attorney. I have my own solo practice in Wisconsin. So I started my show Liberty Weekly in 2017. I was in my second year of law school, and I started discovering all of these, like the works of Rothbard. And I was actually, at the time, it was Stefan Molyneux that got me in. But a lot has happened since then. And I was just really excited by the ideas. And I was annoying the hell out of my friends and family and my wife with talking about the ideas. And so I figured that I would create some kind of outlet so that I wouldn't lose everyone that was close to me. And I think it turned out pretty well. So a couple of years after that, I think the Libertarian Institute came out, and I don't know if I emailed them or something like that and asked to be on the website, and things just kind of went forward from there. And I think that I had very early on, I had made friends with Keith Knight and Kyle Ancelone. And I think this was in like 2018. And so we have just been friends collaborating since then. And we all liked each other's work because we work really hard and we enjoy what we do. And we tried to dive really deep down and get to the bottom of a lot of these things. So it was actually Kyle who has encouraged me throughout my career in the liberty space to get into foreign policy more so, because he's very convincing when he argues that it's the most important issue. And we'll kind of get into this, but I got into the Uyghur stuff and that really set me on the path to covering foreign policy more often on my show.
Yeah, I mean, the anti-war angle is interesting because to a complete normie, maybe somebody like Trump seems anti-war, and then someone who's a little bit more dug in, they'd be like, "Oh no, Tulsi Gabbard is anti-war," and then you like keep digging, and you're like, "Oh wow, no, that's not even anti-war. Anti-war is like super extreme anti-war propaganda." Were you always at that level of extremity, like realizing how much was lies? Because a lot of people are at the point where like we don't want these endless wars in the Middle East overthrowing dictators, but it goes a lot deeper than that. Were you tuned into that at an early stage, or did that take a while to get there?
I think it took a while for me to get there, and I think I wasn't super interested in foreign policy early on in my time in this space, and I think it might have been because I was in law school at the time, and you really have to do a lot of work to stay informed. And this was when Syria was happening, and all those false flag chemical attacks were happening. And I think I kind of kept my finger on the pulse of that just a little bit, but I didn't really dive all the way in. And it was nice to have Kyle as a buddy, because I mean, if you go back in the archives, you'll see I talked about when Turkey was kind of invading Syria in the northern part there, and we kind of got into that a bit, but I really didn't know much of what I was talking about because I focused on, legal stuff and other topics on my show. But I think, in the last couple of years, there's a certain point in time, and maybe you can relate to this, Reed, where you can only talk about the NAP so many times. And I think it's great when people are there and when you're newer in the movement, but I think at some point in time, you really have to start applying theory to practice. And I think that foreign policy is one of the best ways to do that, because you're not living in Ancapistan when you do that. You're grappling with real world problems, and they don't fit very clearly into the NAP framework all the time. So you really have to use a scalpel really to try to, and especially with stuff like the Uyghur issue, you really have to be careful.
Yeah, for sure. So I've done a lot of talking about Ukraine and Russia. And then before that, I've done a lot about Yemen and some stuff about Syria, but I have really not dug into China on this show too much. And that's because, to be honest, if there's any theater I'm not really well versed in, it's China. I know probably more than the average person, but not enough to speak on it with authority. And this year, the Pentagon said that China is the United States' #1 enemy. And that was kind of shocking to me, especially with everything that's going on with Russia right now, that they would say that. So my question is, there is like this belief amongst right-wingers that the Biden administration is just completely sympathetic to China, whatever their goals are, whether it's because of the ties to Rosemont Seneca or whatever it is. They just think that Biden wants to let China get away with whatever it wants to do, and that his administration feels the same way. But that's really not true. If you listen to Antony Blinken, Joe Biden has put sanctions on China for treatment of the Uyghurs or whatever. So I want you to dispel with that myth first, that the Biden administration is friendly to China and ready to let them walk all over the world and walk all over us.
Yeah, this is a really popular kind of sentiment that you hear just in the foreign policy discourse. And it's a very hawkish talking point, is that Joe Biden is weak. Joe Biden is some pitiful old man, which may outwardly be true, but his policy does not reflect that. And I think there's a really good case to be made that Biden is the most hawkish president that we've had on China, even more hawkish than Donald Trump. And of course, a lot of the policies that Biden is continuing and increasing were put into place under Trump. And if you want to get that story, you really have to go to a piece that my buddy and colleague at the Libertarian Institute, Connor Freeman, put out last summer. And he was talking about all of these policies that kind of started under Trump and were continuing under Biden. Encircling China with military bases, selling millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in weapons to Taiwan, embroiling that situation, establishing U.S. embassies in places like the Solomon Islands, pledging to defend Japan's claims to the Senkaku Islands and the Philippines' claims to the Whitsun Reef. So there are all these, little fake islands and little archipelagos and islands around in the South China Sea that we've been pledging to defend. So it's things like forming military alliances with the newest one is AUKUS, and that's the one that they've been pushing is the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And what we've been doing is doing these military interoperability procedures and drills on massive scales with those countries and with other partners in the South China Sea in those areas, involving hundreds of aircraft flying over dozens of airfields, involving thousands of soldiers. And so it's really things like that are really embroiling tensions in that area and really signal that China is in the crosshairs of the U.S. empire. And you mentioned the 2022 National Defense Strategy. I wrote a piece about that called Uncle Sam's Grand Delusion, and that went out this week at the Libertarian Institute. And in there, I talk in depth about what the National Defense Strategy is and how they're trying to say, well, China is our number one enemy. They are our main competitor. But at the same time, they are trying to use this strategy to put a pin in Ukraine. And they're saying, ultimately, we want to abandon Ukraine and kind of the European front to focus on China primarily. But they really want to have their cake and eat it too. I mean, I call it Uncle Sam's delusion because Uncle Sam is delusional if he thinks that he can maintain two main fronts against the named enemies of Russia and China. And what our policy is really continuing that practice of countering them on two fronts, because we're in the middle of a Cold War right now. And this strategy in 2018, James Mattis put forward the National Defense Strategy from 2018, which was the last one before this most recent one. And he called the beginning of renewed great power competition, which is basically a really boring way of saying Cold War 2.0.
Yeah, so most populist right-wingers, I'm not talking like neoconservatives here, like Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, people of that cloth, none of them, I don't think, have been so blatant to say we want to go to war with China, but they want a trade war with China for sure, and they want to sanction China. So, I mean, if you're a libertarian, if you're a Ron Paul libertarian, then you would think that sanctions are an act of war. If goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. So, that's a big problem. that's the attitude that populist right-wingers have toward China. Do you think that our trade with China, which I think China is like our number 2 producer of goods, or is it our number 1? It's number 1 or number 2. It's way up there. And we're also, a huge customer of theirs, obviously. So if there's a way that could lead us toward a more aggressive situation with them, right?
Yeah, I do believe so. And one of the big things about the populist right, people that we might get along with in some issues, I think one of their biggest blind spot is that what they're saying we need tougher China policy, and what they're really saying ignores the context of what I just talked about. All these military escalationism, all these drills, all the weapons sales to Taiwan, the Uyghur genocide campaign that is propagated mostly by the U.S. State Department. Those are the context that's missing when you say we need tougher China policy. And if that's not what you mean, if you don't mean those things, if you condemn those things, then you better be loudly condemning it. And I think it's definitely necessary, because war with China is one of the greatest dangers facing the human race right now. And of course, right now, it's also happening in the backdrop of war with Russia, but in some ways they're kind of one and the same. But I think that you need to be very careful if you're someone on the populist right who condemns those policies but would like to see tougher China policy, which, on some levels it might be a fair avenue to take. I would disagree with it, but there is truth to saying, well, we don't want war with China. But at the same time, if you're advocating all these dangerous policies, what's the difference, really? I mean, and so you need to be very clear about that. But that's kind of what has been my take on the populist right in the China situation.
Yeah. By the way, guys, I just noticed my audio was going through the computer. It should be coming through my microphone now. I don't know if it sounds any different, but yeah. So I want to talk about Taiwan versus China a little bit. What level of threat does a Chinese invasion actually pose right now to Taiwan? Is that realistic after seeing what's happened in Ukraine with Russia and seeing, what happened in Afghanistan after we pulled out? That's the main right-wing talking point I hear, is after seeing how weak we are in Ukraine and seeing what a poor showing we had in Afghanistan, now China is going to feel emboldened with Taiwan. Is there a legitimate fear there? What do you think?
Well, I think that anything can happen. And I think that what we saw with the Ukraine situation is that there were a great many number of people who are very good on foreign policy who didn't necessarily think that Putin would do what he did. So anything could happen. However, looking at the evidence and how it is, I don't think that there's a great danger of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan right now. China has long since said that they desire reunification with Taiwan, that they desire peaceful reunification with Taiwan. However, they recently dropped the peaceful part of it. But make no mistake that reunifying Taiwan with China is an objective for the Chinese. It's a very emotional subject for them. It's something about, ever since you had the Civil War where Chiang Kai-shek fled and the nationalists were defeated and went to Taiwan, they've desired reunification. They see Taiwan as being part of China. And the U.S. did too. And we still should, because it's none of our business. But in terms of even the Project 2049 Institute, which is it's kind of the neocon think tank that has been justifying all these arms sales to Taiwan and kind of brokering them in a way. Even analysts from the Project 2049 Institute they admit that an invasion of Taiwan, a traditional invasion of Taiwan, would be 5 times larger than D-Day. It would involve 1.2 million Chinese soldiers. It would involve tens of thousands of ships. It would involve an invasion force that would be impossible to hide. So there's that aspect. There's the aspect of Taiwan getting all these missiles and arms from the United States, not to mention the United States' own involvement in that area of the world. We've been sailing our warships through the Strait of Taiwan at the rate of almost 1 per month for the last year or two, I believe. So we're heavily involved in that area. We have spy planes flying over the coast of China, surveilling that area, at some times at the rate of 3 to 5 per day. And so if there were an invasion that were being prepared of Taiwan, we would see it. And you have to know that the Hawks would be screaming their pants off, pointing their finger at it, saying, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. So in the coast of Taiwan that faces China only has about 4 or 5 beachheads that could actually have an invasion, like a landing of that type. And I mean, you got to believe they've been pre-sighted for mortars and artillery, that defense plans have been drawn for decades on those areas. So, I could go on and on, but I don't think it's very likely.
So why do we care so much about Taiwan? Is it for trade? Is it for having someone opposed to China right near their border? Well, what is the reason the United States is so invested in Taiwan?
I think it's a few things. I think it is trade because those computer chips are made there. Another thing I forgot to mention is just that I think Taiwan is China's like number 2 or number 3 trade partner. And so there's like billions of dollars of trade going back and forth between them. So any invasion would like to spare that infrastructure. But I think it's strategic because it allows the United States a partner in that area of the world so close to China. It allows the United States to be poking a stick at China from that side, from the eastern side of the country. I think it allows a military foothold. It gives us like a friendly regime to bounce our military off of, in terms of, if the Navy is sailing around that area. If Taiwan is our friend, it makes it less confrontational. So I think it primarily is strategic. There is the trade aspect to it. And the other part is, I mean, it gives Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin someone to buy tons and tons and tons of stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the elephant in the room. This will really piss off any populist right-wingers that are watching this. But I want to talk about the Uyghurs. And before we get into how they're being treated, I want to talk about their history with the CIA, being trained in Afghanistan by Osama bin Laden, and also being in Syria under the command of Turkey. Just kind of give us the history that the Uyghurs have with being used by the United States government, and what the eventual goal of the United States government was once these people were trained, what they intended to do with them.
So some of this comes from Colonel Larry Wilkerson gave a speech at a Ron Paul Institute event a few years back. And he was talking about how the United States has traditionally used the Uyghur, because there are terrorists, there are Uyghur terrorists, and there's a long history of confrontation between the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which I guess, to take a little bit of a step back, Xinjiang is an area the size of France. It's a province of China. It's the westernmost province that borders Afghanistan in part. The Uyghur ethnic group is the most dominant. They're a Turkic Muslim minority. They're the most dominant ethnic group in the area, but they're not the only one. So there's other smaller ethnicities in Xinjiang province. But there has been, they call it East Turkestan. So East Turkestan is a label that the US State Department in some ways has embraced, and like the World Uyghur Congress, these separatists, because ideally they would see themselves having more autonomy away from China. I think some of that embraces secession and actual independence, but there is a movement there, and they have used terroristic tactics. I believe the George Bush administration declared them to be terrorists, that put them on the terrorist list. So in history, you have Eric Margulies telling Scott Horton in a couple of interviews that I cited in my article and documentary that he saw Uyghur terrorists training at with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, I think pre 9/11. So you kind of have those there. What you also have is during the Syrian civil war, you have about 20,000. I think that's the high range of estimate, but it's a sizable number of these Uyghur terrorists going through Afghanistan, going into Turkey, which is a NATO partner, and then fighting in the Syrian civil war on the behalf of the jihadists in that area. So I think there were allegations that Erdogan helped to arm and train and assisted these Uyghurs in the area. But the one major concern that Colonel Larry Wilkerson underlined in that speech was concern that the Uyghurs were going to be going back, because at the time they were going back to Xinjiang. They were going through Afghanistan, which I think through kind of Wilkerson had some concern about their passage, I believe, was my kind of a take that I had. But ultimately, he was saying that while the Uyghurs are a very, very strong proxy force that the United States may want to court, because, and he didn't embrace this, but he said, if you're going to have a winning strategy in Afghanistan, you look at your strategic interests, and your strategic interests include having an area of the world that borders Xinjiang, where you could perhaps court a relationship with these Uyghurs who are going to be in the back door of the Chinese state, and you can radicalize them, you can fund and train them, and you can basically promote regime change operation in that area and cause a lot of havoc, especially in the event of a war with China. You would have an entire back door to China right there that you could, poke and instigate and do that. So you're coming at them from both sides, essentially.
Yeah, so let's get into how the Uyghurs are being treated in China. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but I mean, the claim is that there's a genocide going on, But the reality is that the Han Chinese used to be held to much stricter birthing standards than the Uyghurs. And then in 2017, they were both held to the same birthing standards. So the Uyghurs used to enjoy a lot more freedom than the Han Chinese did. And then in 2017, they were put under the same restrictions. So, I mean, that's still terrible, obviously. Neither of us would support that. But to call it a genocide seems disingenuous, especially when the rest of the country is already held to that standard and then they're put on the same level, or at least to single out the Uyghurs as being genocided seems very disingenuous. Is that accurate, what I just said, or any critique?
Yeah, no, it is. And to preface this out, I mean, obviously we are not people that support any kind of, state atrocity or anything like that. I mean, we're anarchist libertarians. So to be very careful, I mean, it does appear that the Uyghurs are not being treated well by the Chinese Communist Party. I think there is evidence to support that. But the claim has never been, and this is the problem with the term genocide, the claim has never been that the Chinese are massacring on large scale the Uyghurs. In even the most ardent Uyghur advocates don't even claim that there is any kind of mass killing going on.
But they'll use the word genocide still, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And to be, let's see. So if you get into, because the term genocide actually has a definition, and there are 5 different ways that you can cause genocide according to the Genocide Convention of 1948. And this is what is used in the International Criminal Courts. So in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. So the first one is to say killing members of the group, in whole or in part. 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. 5 would be forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So all of those fall flat. The one that,
except for controlling the birth, right? You could say that one applies.
You could say that one applies. However, and that's the way that Team Uyghur, as Peter Lee puts it, as just a term to sum up all these people who are alleging genocide. That's the one that they try and hang their hat on. And
right.
Peter Lee, he just published. He's someone who's been on the Scott Horton show talking about this. We just ran a piece of his called "The Case Against the Uyghur Genocide" on the Libertarian Institute, and I think he gives a very even-handed and fair analysis of the situation, and he talks about there was the Uyghur Tribunal is a UK kind of like people's court where they have actual barristers, people who are attorneys who are assessing this claim. And it's funded, I believe it's funded by the World Uyghur Congress, which is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. So it's very pro-Uyghur, and even they couldn't really make a case that there's a genocide occurring. And what they try to do is they hang their hat on preventing births in whole or in part. And I mean, we could spend an hour and a half, 2 or 3 hours really kind of going over all of this, but it all really stems down to the work of Adrian Zenz, who is he's a German sociologist who came out with this New Lines Institute study, which everyone kind of globbed on and ran away with, especially Mike Pompeo and Trump's administration, to say that a genocide is occurring. And in it, he tried one of his bumper claims was to say that 80% of all net IUD insertions, so intrauterine device, it's a birth control device that is placed in a woman's uterus to prevent conception. he made a statistical miscalculation to say that 80% of all net IUD insertions occurred in Xinjiang during, I think, 2018. And the way that he vastly inflated this statistic, which is one that he created called net IUD insertions, which is insertions of IUDs minus removals of IUDs. And it doesn't really seem like that really would mean much of anything. But he said 80% were taking place in Xinjiang when he actually had inflated that number by, I believe, a factor of 10. So the real number was 8.7% of net IUD insertions were occurring in Xinjiang, which is still, somewhat a little large, but going from 80 to 8.7 in that really
slight discrepancy.
It's a slight discrepancy. And so I want to highlight Peter Lee. He had another article on Patreon where he said he said, I will adopt a homely analogy to illustrate the fallacy of his calculation. So if you'll bear with me here. He said, let us compare viewership for two movies, King Kong versus Godzilla and Justice League. So he says, I watched King Kong versus Godzilla 5 times. I can't stand the DC universe, so I hate watch Justice League 1 time. So that would give Peter Lee net 4 for King Kong versus Godzilla, because that would be 5 minus 1. The rest of my family has a more balanced approach, he says. Between them, they watch King Kong versus Godzilla 24 times and Justice League 23 times. So that would be net 1 for King Kong versus Godzilla. Peter Lee says, therefore, by Zen's logic, Peter Lee accounted for 80% of the net viewership for King Kong versus Godzilla. He says, in reality, I really only accounted for approximately 8.7% of the actual viewership. So that gives you a little bit of, and I'll put a link in, or I'll send you a link to this, Reed, so people who really want to wrap their head around that can read it for themselves.
All right. So aside from the birth control, what level of inhumane treatment are the Uyghurs facing? What are these camps actually like? Do we not know? Are these just completely unfounded claims that we're hearing about organ harvesting and all this? Do we have an idea of what's actually going on, or do we have no idea and there's just not sufficient evidence for this? What's your take on all that?
We have no idea. And you're put in a place where you either have to believe the Chinese Communist Party, which I don't particularly want to do, or you have to believe the U.S. State Department talking about a country that is namedly in their crosshairs.
Yeah, so great options there.
It's you're between a rock and a hard place here.
Right.
And what we can say, because what the Chinese Communist Party openly admits, is that there are facilities where Uyghurs are sent to, and the whole reason for them being there sounds a lot like the war on terror. That Uyghurs are a terrorist group, that there is anti-Chinese sentiment growing amongst them. So what we really need to do is to take them to these facilities, keep them there without due process for a number of months or years, and then release them back into the community after we have taught them job skills. From the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, we've taught them job skills. We've given them like more ties to the Chinese state and done things like that.
So similar to the Japanese internment camps during World War II, neutralizing a threat of an opposing force, basically.
Yeah. And so that might be the most charitable take. There are lots of eyewitness accounts, and this is what gets really hard too. There are lots of eyewitness accounts of rape, people being treated very inhumanely, people, and if you go to the World Uyghur Congress or the Uyghur Tribunal, they document some of these claims. But so all of these kind of I don't know if I want to go far as to say crimes against humanity, but people being treated very poorly. And that is horrible, if to the extent that those claims are true. And I mean, frankly, putting people in facilities against their will or without due process by itself is completely horrible.
Sounds like the United States in 2020 and 2021, sort of.
Yes. Yeah.
Herding people into places where they don't want to be against their will.
Yeah. And so, but this doesn't even get into, and Peter Lee talks about this in the Libertarian Institute case, that this doesn't even get into all of the US-led atrocities against Muslims in the last 20 years. I mean, but moreover, all of these claims of things that are happening in these facilities are coming from suspicious sources that don't have very much credibility, in my opinion. They're anecdotal. They're based on eyewitness testimony, and they're both based on eyewitness testimony from people who have been swept up in organizations that are connected to the U.S. State Department and funded by either the CIA or the National Endowment for Democracy, which is just an organization that does what the CIA used to do covertly, except now they do it openly. So those links I document in my article. A lot of people have done work on these defectors whose stories are constantly changing, and who you find out from their own family in China are either running from the law, from stealing things, or they have other character flaws, reasons to question their credibility. And, of course, there could be any number of reasons why people in China are are saying that they're criminals or anything like that. It could be the screws are being put to them by the Chinese Communist Party. It could be that, but it's enough to damage their credibility, in my opinion, to not take what they say as face value.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's this narrative that you're not allowed to talk about this, that you'll be censored if you do. I haven't really seen that to be the case. And I see everyone talking about it. Tucker Carlson, Bill Maher,
right. Yeah.
Even like the Young Turks and people who are liberals, left leaning or whatever. Like I see pretty much everyone talking about it. The only people I don't see talking about it, I don't know if you saw this exchange on Twitter, but Scott Horton had Max Blumenthal on his show, and Students for oh yeah, you did. I was talking to you about this when it happened. Yes.
Yeah.
For Liberty, some guy from there just freaked out at him, claiming that he isn't a reliable source because he denies the Uyghur genocide and no one should talk to him or whatever. Like, there's just flare-ups like that where I see the opposite of what people claiming. Like, I see people freaking out if you say this isn't a genocide and it isn't one of the worst things that's ever happened in history. I don't really see much censorship on it happening the other direction. Am I wrong? I mean, I haven't seen any.
I mean, as far as if you are an NBA player or someone who is connected to Disney or some kind of corporation that the right alleges has all this control over U.S. media, then maybe yes. But other than that, you're exactly right. It seems like it is in vogue to be calling this a genocide. I mean, you could be Ron DeSantis going on an interview on Fox Business and calling the Olympics taking place in China the genocide Olympics. So it's really popular to be talking about the Uyghur genocide. I've faced considerable backlash for questioning the extent of it.
Right. So let's talk about Epoch News, and this is they're connected to New Tong Dynasty, NTD. This is where a lot of this sentiment is coming from. I was wondering if you could explain what Falun Gong is and how that connects, with what's his name, Li Hongzhi. Is that how you say his name?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I try and say Li Hongzhi because I found, I try to watch the videos and figure out the pronunciation. But so a lot of these claims are being backed up, and by Tim Pool especially, when Tim went on a tear talking about the Uyghur genocide, making allegations of forced gang rape and organ harvesting that was happening on an industrial scale, because those are some of the claims that you'll hear about what's happening in these facilities. And so Tim Pool and this is how I got into this. I mean, I think people have heard me talk about this before, but Tim Pool had on these people from China Uncensored, which is a YouTube channel that talks about they're very anti-China. They talk about a lot of issues with China in the United States. So he had them on maybe 5 times in the span of like 6 months or something. And when they would come on, they would talk about all these things, about organ harvesting and about, mass death and rapes and things like that. And at the time I was working on a documentary about World War I atrocity propaganda and all of the outrageous lies that were told, demonstrably so, from World War I, like the Belgian baby with no hands and babies on bayonets, and the nurse atrocities, the nurses getting raped. And one of them was that there was a story going around in World War I that the Germans were collecting their corpses from the battlefield and winding them up in these big bales of barbed wire, shipping them back to Germany, where they would melt the corpses down to make glycerin for more bombs. And of course, this was printed in the London Times. I mean, this was printed in some of the biggest newspapers in the world. So wow. I was working on this documentary, and I was listening to Tim Pool talk to China Uncensored about organ harvesting and all these different things. And so if you look into the background of these people from China Uncensored, you will find connections to this company called New Tang Dynasty. And you'll find it on their producer's LinkedIn. You'll find it on, if you just look at their broadcast compared to New Tang Dynasty's broadcast, and you'll see that they're clearly shot in the same studio, even though China Uncensored says, hey, we're just 3 people filming this in our living room. No, it's not. And if you look into New Tang Dynasty, you'll see that they have these connections to this group called Falun Gong. And if you even listen to the host, Chris Chappell of China Uncensored, talk about this Falun Gong, it's this, this great spiritualist movement, and these adherents to this are really, really healthy. And China Uncensored and Chris Chappell will deny that they're affiliated with Falun Gong, but he talks about it all the time, and he even brought it up on Tim Pool's show. And Tim didn't think to question him about Falun Gong or anything like that, unless I'm mistaken, but I didn't see it. And so if you look into Falun Gong is the spiritualist movement that started in China. It gained a lot of traction until they ran afoul of the Chinese Communist Party, and they were persecuted. The Chinese Communist Party called them extremists. I don't know if they went so far as to call them terrorists, but they persecuted them. So the leader, the guy who created it all, his name was Li Hongzhi, and he basically picked up the whole movement and moved it to the United States. So he moved to New York City, and eventually him and his adherents bought a compound in upstate New York, where there's a classic facility where he's there kind of as the Grand Poupon. And so there's or the Grand Poobah, should I say. So he's up there, and he has all of his adherents working very hard and giving all their money to the spiritualist group. And some of those adherents created a couple companies. One such company was called the Epoch Times, and the other company was called New Tang Dynasty. And they are they are Falun Gong. Li Hongzhi goes to their events, he speaks, and he gives them their marching orders. He tells them to infiltrate the media, to become regular media, and to destroy the Chinese Communist Party. And so you have transcripts of his speeches at New Tang Dynasty and Epoch Times events, and you can see the slant of their media coverage in what they do. And so the fact that China Uncensored is trying to hide the fact that they are a subsidiary of New Tang Dynasty, the fact that they are Falun Gong practitioners. So Falun Gong, they're the people that will go to DC and go to like New York City holding these signs that say end the Uyghur genocide or stop organ harvesting. And they'll hand out pamphlets and do all those things. And they get on and they make the most outlandish claims about all these things. And I mean, particularly the organ harvesting claim. Chris Chappell and some of the guys from China Uncensored went on Tim Pool and were saying that organ harvesting is happening at an industrial scale. that elites in China will pick up a phone, they'll call an organ service, and they will phone up a prison camp in Xinjiang. They will order a fresh liver, and make sure you get the one from the Falun Gong guy, because he's never had any drugs and he does Tai Chi every morning. So I want that liver in my daughter, or whatever, just these crazy claims. And Tim Pool doesn't push back or ask any follow-up questions or ask what Falun Gong is. He's just like, oh yeah, and then people watch Tim Pool thinking that they're getting some kind of something different than the mainstream media, when no, it's the same shit. It's just told in a way that's more insidious, because you watch him for hours and hours and hours and you get long form Joe Rogan discussions and think that that equals something different than what you're getting from Tucker Carlson or from CNN. It's not. So anyways, that's the long and short of the whole Falun Gong connection.
So basically, we've got a country that is declared our number one enemy by the Pentagon. We have a group of people that was trained by the CIA under and Osama bin Laden and used by NATO allies in Syria for the last couple decades. And we have news sources that are already at odds with the Chinese Communist Party reporting on this. So any takeaways should be taken with a big grain of salt, basically.
Yeah. And I just I primarily urge caution, and for people to push back against this narrative, because Americans, and this is one thing that I wrote about recently, is I called it in my article "Cheese in the Trap," and it got some pushback, not a whole lot, but I think it caused a lot of discussion, which I was really happy about. But I took a step back and I was thinking about it, that over the last decade or 8 years or so, we've had, from the left, we've had Russia. We have the Russiagate hoax. We have, Russia hacking our elections, Russian cyber attacks. You have the Russian narrative behind the Hunter Biden laptop story. So we have one half of the country who's been convinced that Russia is the boogeyman under the bed, that they're going to come up, that they want to destroy the United States, that they have attempted regime change in this country. Half of the country believes that narrative. The other half of the country thinks that the Chinese Communist Party is committing genocide, that they're stealing our intellectual property, that they're buying up professors and they've infiltrated the universities and they're pushing critical race theory, that Chinese fentanyl is flowing across the southern border, as Marjorie Taylor Greene said.
That's my favorite one.
It's just this crazy spooky ooga booga stuff. And so my hypothesis is essentially that these two narratives at some point in time are going to have to intersect. That if the United States has openly declared renewed great power competition, they have named Russia and China as the empire's two biggest enemies. We have one half of the country who is promoting hatred and fear of Russia, and the other half who's promoting hatred and fear of China. At some point in time, we're if we're not already in some kind of fifth generational warfare, which I think is a possibility, although I hate to declare that we're in any war right now, because we're not, that at some point in time these narratives are going to intersect, and the populist right is going to become anti-Russia, and the Democrats they're already kind of anti-China, but that's just all going to come full circle, and it's going to enable a real war.
Yeah, so libertarians are an exception to what I'm about to talk about, but a lot of the people who aren't anti-China, they're straight up tankies, right? They love China and its culture and the Chinese Communist Party and everything. Are you familiar with James Lindsay?
No, I'm not. Well, I know the name, but no.
Okay, so I've had him on my podcast once. He's kind of big these days, and he's talking about critical race theory and a lot of the dissolution of the family structure and of what gender is and all this stuff. And he has basically drawn it all back to it being a communist ideology pushed in our educational system. And I do think he's pretty on target. Like, I mean, he's not making any big leaps. He seems to connect everything pretty well. And I don't think that he himself is a hawk, because I talked to him for 2 hours and he was just pushing libertarian ideals. Basically, we need to reinstate in this country the values of life, liberty, and property. I've never heard him push any neocon talking points. Maybe he has, but I haven't heard it. So I don't have any issues with him or his message, but I feel like a lot of people who listen to him, this just breeds fear, and all they're going to want to do, instead of trying to defund the Department of Education and decentralize education, bringing it back to communities and doing away with the federal stronghold on it, and, you know, pushing all this crap on people, this one size fits all failed government solution that we have. Instead of doing that, I'm just afraid they are going to just, you know, kind of resort back to their neoconservative ways of saying, you know, this is an ideology being pushed by China and Cuba or wherever else, and we need to, even though it's infesting our schools here in the United States, they still want to deal with it in other countries. Like, I mean, I think like we tend to think that the right has gotten a little bit better on war, but it kind of just depends on which war it is. You know, like, if it's war with Iran, man, like, I mean, some of them will be against it, but a lot of them won't. And then when it comes to Cuba, Venezuela, or China, you know, those are socialist or communist countries. So, you know, everything's on the table. Nothing's off the table as far as, you know, being aggressive toward them goes. And that's just really concerning to me, because, you know, I hate Biden, obviously, but I feel like his weakness, his weak, not, I mean, he's not weak on foreign policy, like you said, but his weak composure is actually a good thing, because it makes people really suspicious of what's going on and really skeptical of any move he makes, where Obama didn't have that at all. Obama had a very strong composure, is very eloquent, seemed to have a, you know, a commanding presence and an idea of what he was doing, and he got away with a ton of shit. So like a President DeSantis, who's really hawkish on Iran, really hawkish on China, really hawkish on Cuba and Venezuela, I think could put us in an even worse place than Biden has with Russia. I mean, we'll see what happens with Russia. I hope that we're not stupid enough to actually put boots on the ground in Ukraine or something. But barring that possibility, I'm terrified of the populist right once they get in charge, especially because there's so much desire for vengeance right now, you know, from against the left, which I completely understand after the last couple of years. But I feel like Biden has sold us out to China. The coronavirus was given to us by China, even though, you know, that's actually the United States' fault. It might have happened in China, but if you trace it back to the labs and who was in charge, it's still technically the United States doing that, just like it is in Ukraine. I don't know. Do you share that fear, or what are your thoughts?
No, I'm very concerned about the populist right and about the backlash that we're going to see. And I think that, I mean, talking about those two narratives intersecting, but the other thing about DeSantis is the Israel connection too. I mean, the BDS movement being very strongly condemned. And
one other thing too, before you keep going. I look at DeSantis, I know I brought up Obama. I look at DeSantis exactly the same way that I look at Obama. So you've got someone who was right on the big issue. So for Obama, he was against the war in Iraq, at least, you know, going into Iraq or whatever. DeSantis was mostly good on COVID. And, you know, there's a couple other things that he's sort of based on, like when he doesn't send the National Guard to the State of the Union address or stuff like there's some things, but for the most part, he's really just good on that one thing. Like at least on a presidential level, if you start looking at what he thinks about national security, foreign policy, I mean, he's terrifying. So big red flag there for me, but.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not allergic to praising DeSantis where he's good. You know, he is good on the COVID issue. He's not as good as Kristi Noem was at the beginning, and I tend to be more skeptical of, you know, is this a principled stand that he took? I think I tangled with Tho Bishop a little bit on whether or not DeSantis was taking a principled stand when he did what he did about COVID. And I think it was a calculated risk. It was a big risk, granted, but it was a huge reward. And I think he read the tea leaves and was willing to risk his political career for an opportunity to be thrust into the presidential conversation. And I think if, he's a smart guy, he's a lawyer. I think he was Navy intelligence, wasn't he? Or he was. So, but I was about to say too that did you know this? And I have to give a hat tip to Robbie Martin, whom I know you had Abby on your show, but I had Robbie on my show and we talked about this a bit more. But Robbie is kind of digging into DeSantis's background, and DeSantis called in the IDF when that condo collapsed in Florida. He called the IDF to Florida in uniform to assist with the fallout from that condo collapse. And so you have.
Did he have them bring a bulldozer? Is that what? No.
Right. Yeah. Oh man. Well,
they're good with those, I've heard. So.
Well, I think I don't know if they were in charge of the controlled demolition of the rest of that tower. So, but yeah, I'm very concerned about it, and so I want to do. I see China, and I have to give a hat tip to Dave DeCamp too, because Dave really was the one who, through his writing at antiwar.com, really alerted me to this. And I had Dave on my show and we talked about how important this was, and especially the economic decoupling narrative, because Dave, I think quite accurately, sees our economic relationship with China as being the biggest barrier to a real conflict with that country. And I think there are a lot of forces that are working to try and get rid of that coupling that we have with China economically as trade partners. And I think that once that goes, there won't be a lot holding us together anymore.
Yeah, I totally agree. So just for the last few minutes here, what do you think about the situation in Ukraine at this point? Are you hopeful that it can be resolved, or do you think this is going to turn into another Syria, or do you think we're stupid enough to turn this into World War III?
I think that Connor Freeman and Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter, they have all been doing excellent work on the Ukraine situation. And, Scott has too, of course, but they've uncovered what I think is kind of a concerted effort by the U.S. foreign policy establishment and NATO to prolong the conflict in Ukraine. This was actually written about and admitted in the Washington Post, that I believe either Washington Post or New York Times, that for some in NATO, it is better that the war keep going than to have a peace that comes at too great a cost for Europe. So I think what you really have is the people of Ukraine being sacrificed at the altar of Europe, being put into the meat grinder, and are being sacrificed to prolong a war with Russia in Ukraine, where I think Zbigniew Brzezinski said in 2014 something about how it would be wonderful to cause an insurgency in Ukraine and to lure Russia into fighting a war on its border, and to have it basically give them another Afghanistan from the 1980s. And you have weapon shipments going into Ukraine that are not weapons that would, they would get us into World War III, but weapons like tanks and aircraft and really high-tech stuff that Zelensky could use to actually beat Russia, which I don't think is even a possibility with those weapons. But the weapons that are going to him are insurgency weapons. They're small arms, they're shoulder-fired rockets. I'm sure there's explosives going in there too. There's, you have the CIA training Ukrainian paramilitary groups and I believe military groups in Ukraine leading up to what this war was. And so I think the real goal here from the side of NATO and the foreign policy establishment is to prolong the war in Ukraine as long as possible. And they're using Zelensky, I believe, as a useful idiot to make that happen, stringing him along with promises and pledges of support. But really, in actuality, his people are there to bleed and die well, we get what we want, and that is to beat Russia down and to ultimately cause regime change in that country.
All right, man. Well, where can people keep up with you? In the description, I've got your Twitter and your YouTube linked, but what interesting shows have you got coming up, and where else do you want people to keep up with your work?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on, Reed. Really glad to connect with you when you came on my show last week and to get a chance to talk about stuff I've been working on your show. People can go to libertyweekly.net. That's kind of your one-stop shop. Otherwise, the Libertarian Institute right now we're having a fundraiser. We have matching pledges. So up to the next $20,000, there's a generous donor that has decided to match pledges. So we really, really need your help to continue all the hard work that we're doing. People like Keith Knight, Kyle Ancelone, Connor Freeman, Tommy Salmons, Will Porter, and all of our great team of writers over there at the Institute. So we've been trying to work really hard throughout this Ukraine crisis to let everybody know what's going on. As for me, on my show, I'm doing an episode on the Project 2049 Institute, which is I think I mentioned it in this show. It's the think tank that is behind the weapons sales to Taiwan. So I want to do an expose of that. And then I have Lori Calhoun from the Institute. I'm interviewing her about her book, War and Delusion, next week. And that's actually where she talks about the fallacy of just war theory. And she's done a lot of work on killing in war, which is another one of my focuses that I do a lot of work on. So people want to sign up for my Substack, libertyweekly.net/Substack. I've been pre-publishing my articles there, doing bonus content. And I think it's one of the best Substacks in the Liberty movement. There are a few good ones, but I'm really trying to make mine the best. But those are all my plugs, man. Thanks again.
Yeah, pleasure to have you on, man. We'll have to do it again. Yeah, everybody, this episode really kind of mirrors the episode I did with Daniel McAdams as far as furthering CIA talking points, especially when they're coming from such shaky information that's most likely not true. But even if it is all true, us getting militarily involved or putting sanctions or waging some sort of economic war with China would absolutely not make life better for anybody. So don't buy into it. Don't repeat it. They tug on our heartstrings saying stand with Ukraine or, stand with Hong Kong, stand with Taiwan, whatever. But this is the same government that has been supporting the starvation of people in Yemen, the starvation and murder of people in Palestine, and also invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and supported overthrowing the government in Libya, bringing slavery back, and supported ISIS and Al-Qaeda against Assad in Syria. So that's just the last 20 years too. So, take everything they say with a grain of salt and realize no matter how bad another country is, that your government is supporting worse things. And even if it were to get involved, things would not get better. But I'll have Dave Smith on the show on Tuesday night. And then a week from tonight, we're doing the Four Horsemen, and Alex Stein is our special guest. So make sure to tune in for that. And yeah, go follow Patrick. I've enjoyed his stuff. And we'll do it again, man. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, if I could read one last thing. I'm sorry to there's another level too beyond this whole thing. And you'll see people in the United States talking about China saying, oh, they're so awful and they're so horrible. They're so bad. They lock people down. But wouldn't it be awesome if we could do that here? And so there's a whole level. You had James Corbett on, one of the Four Horsemen. And I every time I love his work, and he talks about like the 3D chess that's going on too. So there's the national level of nation states fighting, but then there's a level above it. And if you look at the development of China, you'll find people like Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller and all of these swamp creatures, the elites that are also involved in financing that country. And they are not providing an alternative to the US-led unipolar world order. They are propagating the same new world order, all of the technocratic stuff, all of the transhumanist agenda. So don't go thinking that China or Russia are presenting a different type of world that's better than what the West has planned for us. So I just had to throw that in there. libertyweekly.net/170 is my interview with James Corbett, where we go in depth on this. So you'll want to check that out too. But sorry about that.
No, thanks for throwing that in for sure, guys. James Corbett's great. Another guest I'd like to get back, but go follow Patrick. I got the links in the description and libertyweekly.net. I will add that. It's not in there for the live viewers, but if you're watching this afterward or listening to it, it should be there. So go check those out. Everyone have a good Sunday night. Patrick, thanks again.
Thank you.